Good morning, everyone. Uh, I'm Kyle Shelton, the Deputy Director of the Kinder Institute for Urban Research. Thanks for joining us this morning to hear about the 2020 State of Housing in Harris County and Houston report. We're very excited to have you all here today. Just a few pieces of information about the agenda and some logistics for the day. First, I want to start with some thanks, especially to our report's lead underwriter, Wells Fargo, for their ongoing support of this project into year 2 as well, and for their support for this initial report. We're very thankful to have their support. We also want to thank the Houston Association of Realtors, who provided the Kinder Institute with aggregated sales data for a number of the indicators in this report. And then I also want to thank the Kinder team, who's worked really diligently on this report over the last several months. John Park, Carlos Villegas, Luis Guajardo, Chris Servideo, Bill Fulton, Jay Wu, Mingming Zhang, and Dimitri Messin. A few logistics. I'm sure many of you are now quite used to webinars, but please put your questions in the Q&A box at any time. If they're particularly informational, a few of my colleagues will try to answer them as we go. What we're going to do today, I'm going to give a brief report about some of the key findings from the report. We'll do probably about 10-minute Q&A on some of that discussion, and then we'll head into a really great conversation with our panelists today about COVID and housing, and then end with some more in-depth Q&A for both panelists, and can also touch more on the report as well. Please tweet and share your thoughts with us at RiceKinderInst on Twitter. My handle is at Kyle K. Shelton, and we're using the hashtag State of Housing today. And with that, I'll get right in. So the purpose of this State of Housing report, this inaugural report, is that we want to establish a baseline of housing data for over 60 key housing indicators. And critically, what we want to do is provide annual data updated each year to inform policy, potentially inform development choices, and for folks like ourselves, inform future research questions. And at the same time, we're working to make that data available to all stakeholders involved in the housing sector and residents of communities throughout Harris County and Houston. We are making that data available at the community level. Many of the indicators are on the Houston Community Data Connection site, which you can go through datahouston.org to find. So we also want this to be a living responsive report. It's going to be ongoing and updated each year. And so both any feedback from today and questions from today will continue to take a list of what folks are wanting to see and how people are wanting to use the report and what else we can do to make it useful for the range of folks who we hope will use it. And so we're really looking forward to that conversation, and we will likely do a workshop sometime in the early fall in some form to continue to get input from you all about what that can look like. So a couple of the key findings, and I'm going to dive into these in more depth as I go here. For the majority of folks, the reputation of Harris County and Houston is that it's an affordable place to most residents. And one of the things that we want to highlight and see and show everyone is that though that reputation for affordability is at odds with rising housing prices and a lot of the trends that we're seeing in the most recent data. Even for median income households, buying a home in the city of Houston and in Harris County is becoming increasingly difficult. For low-income renters, there are almost insurmountable hurdles in purchasing a home, but finding affordable homes of all types is continuing to be a struggle for many low-income renters. Black home ownership rates have continued to decline more than other racial and ethnic groups in Harris County and Houston, and 1 in 4 homes remain at risk for flooding. And what we mean by risk for flooding is within the current 500-year floodplain. So that's likely going to be many of those homes are likely to be moved into more elevated risk categories when the flood maps are updated, and many will be moved into the 100-year floodplain, and many more households will be added to the 500-year floodplain. Throughout the data slides that I'm going to show you shortly, we look at Harris County as a whole, inclusive of the city of Houston, and then the city of Houston apart. And the reason we do that is because it's really important that we think about the housing situation in Harris County as across those jurisdictions. The challenges are across those jurisdictions, and even though many of the steps that we can take, whether by the City of Houston or Harris County or other jurisdictions, may be limited to a certain geography, we think it's really important to look at things holistically. So I'll do my best to describe the geographies we're talking about, but in general, it's Harris County as a whole and the City of Houston. And I'm just going to make a quick reminder to panelists, if you're not muted, to please mute yourself. And before I jump in, I also do want to talk about the ways that COVID, the energy sector downturn, and the current racial justice movement and protests that we're seeing around the country tie into this. One of the things, obviously, from COVID is that it has made the vulnerable even more vulnerable. A thing I want to highlight at the beginning here is that the impacts of COVID and the energy bust are not fully visible in this report. And that's because much of the data that we're working with is from the American Community Survey and the US Census Bureau, and there is a delay in that data. And so many of the direct impacts and the seeing of that in some of that data will not be available until 2021 and 2022 as we update these reports annually. But what we see the importance of this work as is establishing a really critical baseline, much in the way that the Kinder Houston Area Survey has established a timeline of ideas and opinions over a number of years. We think having this 2020 State of Housing report as a baseline to understand impacts going forward is going to be really critical. Obviously, COVID and the energy sector bust are creating huge unemployment issues and destabilizing housing for thousands of households. We do look at places as up to date as we can in the data, and two of the places that we're tracking that I know we'll talk about more with our panelists shortly are evictions and homelessness. Altogether, we've seen over 350,000 unemployment insurance claims in Harris County since March 20th, 2020. And so we know that hundreds of thousands of homes are seeing huge drops in income, which are complicating all sorts of things, especially housing costs and being able to afford housing. A few other numbers about the impacts of COVID, just to kind of set the stage for what we're talking about. And as a reminder, thinking about a lot of these impacts won't be visible for a number of years. So the challenges we're already facing are likely to get worse. So a few other things to pull out here. The Turner Center for Housing Innovation at Berkeley has, and many other institutions, including our panelist Mary from the Urban Institute, have been looking at how the crises are going to be impacting low-income families and renter households in particular. The Turner Center's estimate is that 362,000 households in the Houston metro area have been directly impacted by layoffs, and those households are paying at least $420 million in rent. And so not only is there a major challenge for those households who are experiencing extreme disruption and extreme stress from seeing layoffs and having incomes be lowered, they're struggling potentially to pay rent, struggling to pay for other costs, but then those things also upstream to landlords and to lenders. And so the entire system can really be stressed. And that's with the eviction moratoria and stimulus support ending, that's going to be a major challenge for us going forward here. And then finally, amidst all the calls for racial justice in public safety, but in also broader society, we think it's critical to recognize that stable housing is an essential part of so many elements of a stable life, whether it's physical and mental health, access to opportunity, or the creation of long-term financial stability for a household or individual. The disparities that are faced by Black, brown, and low-income residents in our housing system are certainly a part of that broader societal challenge. And we hope that by identifying some of those gaps and thinking about where some of those inequities are rooted, we can help to inform work and inform policies to address them. So we're looking forward to continuing that conversation and work with all of you. All right, and now to some of the data. What we're seeing across the board is that housing prices are rising. Median sales prices in Harris County and Houston have both gone up by about 37% and 38% respectively. This image is showing you Harris County in blue and the City of Houston in orange, going from 2011 to 2018. The median sales price in the county grew from $139,000 in 2011 to $220,000 in 2018, and it grew even more in the city of Houston from 167,000 in 2010 to 268,000 in 2018. That's a benefit for a lot of existing homeowners who see their assets grow and have more wealth and are able to pass that on to children and future generations. It can be a challenge for folks who are on fixed incomes and are seeing higher property taxes. And it's also a major obstacle for folks who are trying to become new homeowners, as I'll discuss more in a second. Gross rent has also gone up considerably, about 8% if we adjust for inflation. And the rising housing prices across the board are leading to growth in renter households. So 45% of households in Harris County are now renters, and that number is 57% in the city of Houston. Those are both large increases since 2010. And it means that there are more competition for the units that are existing, and for folks on lower incomes, with lower incomes who are looking for affordable housing, that means there are more folks with higher incomes also interested in finding safe and affordable homes, and there is more competition for an increasingly smaller number of affordable units. And specifically, we see rents skyrocket in some neighborhoods, and I'll highlight just a couple. Several sort of high amenity, high demand neighborhoods such as East Downtown and other more walkable areas like the Washington Corridor have seen rents grow considerably. In East Downtown, it was a 220% increase between 2010 and 2018. But we're also seeing rents grow very quickly in redeveloping communities that are historically African-American and low income. One example of that is the Settegas neighborhood, where rents rose by over 100% from 2010 to 2018. And in those communities, it's often a signal of redevelopment pressures and a potential risk of displacement, excuse me. And so that's something that we're continuing to keep an eye on as we go forward here. In general, those rising prices are making affordability even harder for all sorts of households. These images show you 2011 and 2018. And it is the affordability gap, which is the difference between what a median income household can afford in terms of its income for a home. So the normal approach is that you shouldn't spend more than 30% of your income on housing. And if you're doing that, you're considered cost burden, and I'll show some more about that in a second. But the affordability gap shows the difference between what is an affordable home to a median income household and what is the median sales price. And across the board, we can see that that gap is getting worse. In 2011, if you look at the blue column on the farthest left, that is all households, which include renters and owners. The median income for all households in 2011 was $52,000 in Harris County, and they could afford a home that was roughly $163,000. However, the median sales price was $139,000, as you can see at the gray line. So for all households, there was a surplus. They could afford most median priced homes. When you move to 2018, you see that that gap is growing. So for the income for a median household, the median household income across all households had risen to just over $60,000 by 2018. But the median sales price had grown to $220,000, well above the affordable housing price of $186,000. So you see for all households a growth in the gap from a surplus of $24,000 in 2011 to a gap of $33,000 by 2018. If we look at renters, which are the gray columns on the right, the issue is even larger. And the important distinction to make here is that among renters, household income is lower. So if you're just looking at renter households, the median household income is lower. So in 2011, the median household income for renters in Harris County was $33,000, which meant they could afford a home of about $104,000 without subsidy. And you can see that gap right here on the left graph in the gray column. And by 2018, the median income for renters had only grown to $40,000, and that meant they could afford a home of $126,000. But again, the median sales price had jumped to $220,000, almost a $93,000 gap. So again, for low income, even median income renter households, affording a home, purchasing a home is nearly impossible without significant subsidy. And there's more detail on this in the report, but in the city of Houston, just looking at the city of Houston, the gap is even greater. For renters, that affordability gap is almost $150,000 in 2018. All of those prices also contribute to growing cost burden challenges. And again, cost burden is when a household is spending more than 30% of their income on just their housing related costs. And you can see here, and folks are considered cost burden if they reach that 30% threshold, and then they're considered severely cost burdened if they pass 50% of their household income. And what we see here in this graph is the blue columns are showing the owners and renters who are cost burdened, so spending more than 30% of their income, but less than 50% of their income on housing. And then the orange columns are those who are spending more than 50% of their income on housing. So for homeowners, you can see from 2010 to 2018, the cost burden challenge got better, slightly improved. Homeowners with burden overall declined from 29% to 21%. But for renters, the numbers stayed the percentages stayed very consistent, and the number of households grew quite considerably between 2010 and 2018. About 50% of renters in Harris County are cost burdened, spending more than 30% of their income on housing. And nearly a full quarter of Houston renters are spending more than 50% of their incomes on housing, leaving them with very few resources to make up any other costs, whether healthcare, education, or food. So it's a major challenge. And part of why we're seeing that is because we're seeing a loss of affordable units. And I'll show a couple slides here to explore this. These are rental units documented by gross rent. And what you can see is that existing affordable units are disappearing. The number of units that were available for rent at less than $800 was over 250,000 units in 2010, and that's declined to just over 150,000 by 2018. And we are also seeing a huge jump in more expensive units, especially multifamily, that are built for higher price points. You can see a large growth in the number of units over $1,000. And what we see from previous research that we've done with Link Houston around the connections between transportation and housing are that many of the affordable units, especially in the city of Houston, but throughout the county, are further away from job centers and are having higher transportation costs. A similar pattern is visible in home prices, as I've already discussed. You can see that while there's some natural growth in home prices, of course, in a hot real estate market, there's also a large increase in the number of homes that are for sale at numbers well above the median price. Again, the median price in Harris County in 2018 is $220,000. So you can see immense growth in homes well above that price range, which is making the number of units available to lower income families, whether it's rental or for sale, are shrinking, and that's complicating the issue. And as I talked about before, with growing renter populations, it's significantly a challenge as more people are competing for fewer affordable units. At the same time, the rising prices and ongoing struggles of many households to recover from the Great Recession all the way back starting in 2008, what we're seeing is declining home ownership. And while it happens across all racial and ethnic groups in the county, it is most precipitous for Black homeowners. You can see in Harris County on the left here, 2010 to 2018, a decline of homeownership rate among African-American owners from 41% to 37%. It's even more stark in the city, 37% to 31%. And obviously a major challenge with this is that, again, homeownership is a major asset building tool in the United States. And this challenge of securing and passing on generational wealth is particularly acute for Black households in our area, and certainly ties into a lot of the other challenges that we're facing. Similarly, Black households' median income is lower than all other racial groups. And so while we're seeing the homeownership rates fall, we're also seeing Black households struggle with cost burden and other challenges more because their incomes are also low. So the incomes and housing connection there is also very important to think about. And one piece we highlight in the report is that a lot of the communities where Black homeownership rates are falling most are also areas that have been hit by major flooding in the last 5 years. And so there's a clear connection between climate change and the brunt of some of the challenges that our region's facing and some of these broader challenges around homeownership. And then finally, we do talk in the report about a number of demographic changes. I want to highlight some of those here. Households are trending generally away from nuclear families of 4 as the overwhelming demographic. It's married households are still the majority, but we saw immense growth amongst people living alone, couples with children, single parents, and houses with unrelated housemates. And that's certainly contributing to a change in some of the market demands. We see growth in multifamily permits. In 2018, multifamily was 50% of permits in the county and 60% in the city. So there's a trend of increasing the number of multifamily units happening. There's also immense growth in folks over the age of 65 and those with disabilities. And as you can see from this map, which shows in orange the community tabulation areas, which are kinder data boundaries, are roughly neighborhoods broken down by census boundaries. The CTAs with the highest percentage in population over age 65 and those CTAs with the highest percent change in population with a disability, and all of those are happening, many of those are happening on or outside of Beltway 8. And so what we're going to be seeing is increasing challenges in ensuring that the homes and the services to both those groups are available, and is certainly, again, a trend to continue to watch. Another piece that we highlight in the report is that households led by folks who are age 25 to 39 are basically moving 50-50 between the county and the city core between 2010 and 2018, with about 15% growth in each. So there is some of this millennial age moving to both city and high amenity areas, but also an ongoing trend to the county. The one piece that's important to highlight there is that those households with children are still more likely to move into the county. So with that, I'm going to stop my quick overview and remind you that the full report is available on our website at www.kinder.rice.edu. The community level data is available at datahouston.org, and I'm happy to take any feedback or questions offline that I'm not able to answer now at kyle.k.shelton@rice.edu. And before we move to the discussion, I'm happy to answer a few questions about that presentation or others directly about the report findings. Somebody's asking what were we most surprised by? I think in general, wanting to highlight just the growth of the gap of the affordability challenge is really surprising. Just the scale of the difference between what a median household income can get you in Harris County and Houston is really alarming. I think that's the piece that I would highlight. And again, that's separate from thinking about the whole metro area, but for Harris County and Houston, just seeing that challenge is immense. There's a question about additional information for people with disabilities. At this point, we don't have anything deeper than the general location of those folks by the CTA, but this is, again, and this is maybe something I'll say in answer to a couple other questions, we are very interested in continuing to adapt and update this work as we go forward each year. And that is a space where if there are other ideas about what we should be sharing or how we should be thinking about a particular group or population or challenge that they're facing, we're happy to hear that. So thank you for flagging that, and would welcome ideas about how to explore that more. A good question about why some homes are market priced well above valuation. Obviously, it depends on every situation is separate, but I think in a lot of those cases, the times that the housing prices, the market prices are much higher than the valuation is because those neighborhoods are in very high demand, whether it is a home that people are purchasing to live in, or whether it's a home that a property people are purchasing to potentially redevelop. In a lot of communities, and the questioner asked about the East End, in a lot of communities where there's high demand for property, the prices go up, often associated with the land prices. And then I'm gonna answer one last question before we shift to the panel, and then we can answer some general questions and ask the panel some questions as well. We'll have about 20 minutes at the end there. The last question I wanted to touch on is how we compare to Texas and the US, and that's another great question, and one within the full report where we look in a couple of places. We do that comparison, mostly on the macro economic trends and larger market trends. In the first section of the report, we do a number of comparisons. And one of the reasons why we didn't dive too deeply into comparisons is that there was part of the motivation was to want to really understand the types of challenges we're facing locally. And that doesn't mean we shouldn't do those comparisons, but I think it does help us really first grapple with, we're seeing 300,000 households struggling to find affordable homes and struggle to find access to opportunities. And one thing that we want to make sure we have as part of this baseline is understanding what that scale is locally. And then I think as we go forward, thinking about how that compares to other cities, and also potentially how Harris County and the city of Houston are acting to close those gaps. That's when, to my mind, comparisons become really valuable, because we can see how actual shifts are happening and how cities are responding. And that's a piece that we want to consider adding in the future. But for this one, it's really about establishing what we're seeing here with a few comparisons throughout. So with that, please keep the questions coming. Please continue to put them in the Q&A, and we'll look at some more as we move forward. I want to move to our discussion with our esteemed panel today, which is going to look mostly at COVID and housing. And we're doing this focus, as I said at the beginning, because a lot of the data that I was able to share with you all and from the report doesn't directly reflect the impacts of COVID. And so we want to make sure that we can root some of this conversation and root some of this initial work to this larger challenge that we're all facing, and to think about how housing fits into it. So I would like to ask our panelists to unmute themselves and turn their video on. Today we're joined by Mary Cunningham, who's the Vice President of Metropolitan Housing and Community Policies at the Urban Institute, by Allison Hay, the Executive Director of the Houston Habitat for Humanity, and by Dr. Chris Herbert, the Managing Director of the Joint Center for Housing Studies of Harvard University. Welcome, everybody. I see Mary and Chris. Allison, your video is not on yet if you want to join us.
I know.
Okay.
Sorry.
We can hear you. We can hear you.
Okay.
So that's great.
All right.
Well, welcome, everybody. Thanks for joining us. I'm going to stop the share in just a moment so that everybody can see us more front and center, but I want to leave the contact information, the Twitter handles up for just a moment if you want to keep adding. Y'all, could we start by just talking about what you are each seeing as the biggest challenges posed by COVID, and generally how those challenges are affecting our efforts to safely house residents and the broader housing sector?
You want anybody else?
Yeah, Mary, maybe why don't you start? Sorry,
Sure, no problem.
I'll direct.
Yeah, that's great. Well, first of all, thanks for having me here today. It's a terrific presentation, and I'm sure a lot of work went into this report, so congratulations to everyone on the team who put it together. And I see that you have almost 300 participants on this call, and that's just terrific. In terms of the sort of challenges that we're facing in COVID, I think that, we went into the pandemic with housing challenges across the country. We had a significant affordability crisis. There was no place, no county across the country that had enough affordable housing. So we had already a lot of, particularly concentrated among low-income renters, people who were significantly cost burdened. I think that Chris's report, the Harvard report, the State of the Nation, really shows that we had this significant housing challenge. And then we layered on significant unemployment, 15% unemployment, with people losing their jobs pretty rapidly in a short time. I think Congress did respond with the CARES Act, and that has, we can talk about whether or not that's doing its job, but I think in a lot of ways it is for some people. But we certainly are facing significant unemployment and without a sort of medium or long-term plan. So I think we are going to continue to face challenges. I know there is just a lot of concern about the sort of coming cliffs of eviction moratoria expiring, and also the unemployment benefits, sort of the $600 plus up expiring as well. So I'm sure we'll get into that today, but just significant housing problems made worse by sort of the economic fallout of COVID-19.
Thanks, Mary. Chris, what are you seeing?
So, I would say I agree with what Mary said. I think fundamentally what we're seeing is a situation where so many households are struggling to be able to afford their housing each month, and then you factor in 15% unemployment, huge loss of income, and how that's exacerbated the issues. I guess one thing I'd point out is that there's a lot of concern, rightly so, about renters, as we don't really have the channels for providing support to renters that we do, say, on the homeowner side, where 70% of mortgages are backed by the federal government, either Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, or FHA, VA. But I would point out that even with that ability to reach homeowners, that homeowners are struggling as well. So this is certainly renters, lower incomes, less support. But one of the things that's out there to help document the extent to which the COVID pandemic has been affecting households is a survey done weekly by the Census Bureau called the Pulse Survey. And they're asking us a large sample of households, did you lose income? Did you have trouble making your rent or mortgage payment? Did you have food insecurity and the like? And from that, we have a pretty good picture of the share of households who are struggling to make their payments. And I just want to point out on the homeowner side, it's even though there's the opportunity for forbearance through these federal programs, we're seeing is that among African Americans in particular, nearly 20% didn't make a payment last month. And of those, only 6% actually took advantage of a deferral. 13% didn't make a mortgage payment and didn't get a deferral, and so are at risk of foreclosure. So even though we have supports for homeowners, they're not necessarily reaching folks as widely as we would hope, and putting people at risk of losing their homes as well. And your report, really very compellingly documented the issue with very low rates of homeownership among African Americans that are falling. And if you then factor in the risk of those folks to losing their home going forward, this is really a significant challenge and problem that we need to address.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, and I think highlighting that survey, noting all of the interconnection of housing costs and food and all of those other pieces are really critical to keep foregrounded as well. Allison, sorry that your video is not working. It's the joys of our Zoom existence these days. But can you talk to us a little bit about what you're seeing on the ground here in Houston and with clients at Habitat for Humanity? What are some of the direct impacts COVID's been having on you all and on your clients?
And I apologize. It worked a minute ago, but technology and I don't know. So, but the effects of COVID have layered on the effects that we've had from our 2017 Hurricane Harvey. So Houston has had several housing disasters, and the COVID component has only made our fragile populations, homeowners that are seniors or disabled or are low income homeowners, it's made it harder for them, number one, to make a mortgage, but number two, most of these houses that we see, a significant number of low income families still are in need of repair from Hurricane Harvey. And so to ask them to stay home during a pandemic in a home that has not been completely repaired and has health issues in it with mold, we see an increased risk of health issues for these families coming. And we also see the fragile component of their income. They are trying their best to use small reserves, but as the crisis continues, we're going to see families that have been able to make their mortgage be struggling more.
Yeah, I think, Allison, thanks for making that connection back to Hurricane Harvey and the importance of recognizing that a lot of the challenges with already low incomes before we're getting to COVID and trying to find ways to update and make homes safe, recover and make homes safe again after Harvey is just continuing to roll forward for lots of folks. So it's just sort of multiple disasters and challenges are catching up to us here in Houston and in other places around the country. I'd like to maybe set a little bit more historic background and think just a little bit about some of these inequities that you all have already talked about and some of what I hit on in the report as well. But particularly, as I mentioned, we're already seeing before COVID really drastic gaps and vast inequities between households of color and communities of Black and brown and low income communities. And white neighborhoods. Can we talk a little bit about why some of those inequities exist longer term and where some of those pieces are rooted? Mary and Chris, from some of your all's research and just experiences in this space, what are some of those long rooted challenges that we're confronting?
Chris, you want to take this first, since I went last?
Sure. And Kyle, this is a big question, so we could spend a lot of time on this. But you know, fundamentally, if you think about the housing market and housing inequality, it goes back to a long history of intentional and pervasive attempts to segregate folks by race, and essentially to keep African Americans in particular in segregated neighborhoods, often with much poorer public services, much housing in much worse conditions. And while today it may be the case that the evidence of overt discrimination is not nearly what it was 30, 40, 50 years ago, there is still discrimination. The Urban Institute, Mary's colleagues, every 10 years for HUD document the extent to which minorities and others are treated differently in the housing market. And while not the door slamming, the fact that it was true in the past is not there today, there's still ways in which information is not shared as widely. People are steered to certain areas and the like. And so, but beyond that, I think what we really have to look at is the question of the legacy of that historical discrimination. And so when we talk about structural or systemic racism, what are we talking about? Well, we're talking about the fact that African Americans through their history have had less access to quality public education, have had less access to healthy neighborhoods, both of which impact their ability to compete in the labor market and to earn an income. And so when we look at those disparities in home ownership rates, for example, 31 percentage points between African Americans and whites in Houston, which is close to what it is nationally. If you look at it statistically, you can say, well, you know, a share of that is due to the fact that their education is less, their incomes are less, their family structure is less. All of those things are remnants of historical discrimination that make that African Americans at a disadvantage to begin with. And housing, I would argue, we're all housers here, is so critical to the continuation of that systemic structural racism, because it still impedes people's access to public services and healthy environments and the like. So, you know, really, when you look at the outcomes in the housing market, they're reflective of so many other ways in which histories and legacies of discrimination have impacted African Americans and Latinos and others as well.
Yeah, that was a great overview, Chris. And I mean, I think you can look back historically and see that the history of segregation and also discrimination in the housing market and the employment markets. The history of segregation and where people live is particularly sticky. I mean, I think those geographic patterns have stuck with us for a very long time. And as Chris noted, we have done paired testing discrimination studies, and I've showed that while the gap has decreased, there are still a lot of discrimination in the market. And in fact, last year we looked at, for example, housing choice voucher holders in nearby Fort Worth and Dallas area, and found that 78% of landlords didn't accept housing choice vouchers. And so not only are people who are unsubsidized in the market facing sort of historical segregation patterns, but also people who have subsidies are facing discrimination. And I think more importantly, not only is there that history, which I think explains why we are where we are, which is that disproportionality and overrepresentation of people of color in homelessness and disparities of among renters and significant home ownership gaps also explains where we're headed in the future, because as Kyle pointed out, many of the ways that people move up and build wealth in this country is through their homes. And so locking out that access really locks in this sort of this disparity for the near future. So really opening up the ability and having access to home ownership is really important to close some of these disparities. And I also think that making sure that renters are able to access neighborhoods with good schools and amenities so that they can, that are safe, so that they can also have what they need to be able to move up the economic ladder is also really important to overcome these sort of long-term disparities.
Yeah, and I think I've been very interested in the narratives around COVID have really focused on both renters and homeowners in a way that I think a lot of the conversation around the housing sector doesn't normally include renters.
Mm-hmm.
And it's going to be interesting to see that most recent round of guidance from HUD is mainly focused on FHA-backed homeowners, and the question of what's going to happen for renters, I think, is going to come to the foreground, as you all have already mentioned. Allison, how do you see some of these longer-term inequities playing out in the work that you guys are doing with Habitat?
So for what we've seen, it even goes back farther to the 2008 economic crisis with for mortgages and for families that are trying to get mortgages. The Dodd-Frank Act should have been a way for homeowners to have more access with better banking practices. And what we've seen, especially after 2015, was a tightening of restrictions on families with credit. So the 30% affordability quotient is into the determination of whether you can qualify for a mortgage, but the back end was tightened up, and families and individuals, especially young people with a lot of credit from their school, when they have that debt, there's hardly any way for them to be able to then qualify for a mortgage. So I feel that the restrictions, that the intent for the Dodd-Frank was really good, and back when it was established, 2010, but we haven't been able to see the economic, how it bears fruit. And I think on the low income, on families that were in the lower part of trying to be able to get a home, I think that's where you start to see that disconnect that you showed in the report, where we don't see younger families and individuals being able to afford a home for that first-time home buyer. And so it's more to it. It's also the mortgage and the laws of the mortgage, especially if they're not FHA backed. And a lot of the homeowners that we see, they go to other banking sources to get their mortgages.
Yeah, and that raises an interesting question that Chris touched on as well, which is just sort of the difficulty and importance of level setting and general education around the things that are available and what tools are available and how to navigate those. It's not just the creation of the program at the federal level or at the state or local level. It's also the difficulty in helping households navigate those. And as we've talked about, many of those households are facing, compounded challenges that are not limited to the housing costs. And so asking folks to navigate the mortgage process, asking folks to navigate deferral process at the same time that they're struggling at this moment to find hours and find work is a massive challenge as well. Chris, I wanted to see if you could talk a little bit about what you all are expecting to see in the broader housing market with COVID, and what you're already seeing, what you guys are tracking at a national level, and where you anticipate that going in the coming months.
Yeah, I think when this first hit in March, and it was clear that the economic impact was going to be as devastating as it is, my first instinct was to think that this was going to result in a fall off in demand for housing and some relief from house price pressures and rent pressures that we've been experiencing over the last few years. And what's been surprising for me, particularly on the house price side, is how much housing prices have actually held up. And I think what we're going to see is the data coming out now is from the worst of it through April and May. Going forward, expect to see actually house prices are likely to keep going up and maybe even accelerating. And what it really highlights is the fact that this pandemic is taking place, this economic dislocation, in the context of a very supply-constrained housing market. And so since the Great Recession, actually, we have not been building housing at a rate at which we've been adding households. And so vacancy rates have been getting tighter and tighter, and particularly at the low end of the scale, either in terms of home purchase, as your report points out, or in rent. We're seeing those available units shrink in number as house prices rise. And so I think, unfortunately, what we're going to see is that COVID is going to take the bottom out of demand for some households, but for the 85% of the market that's still employed, there is, in fact, an increased demand for housing. The importance of having a home now has been highlighted by this pandemic. There's been a big rush in many areas to suburban housing, and that's going to make the market tighter and drive up prices. So for those who have, I think that they'll do well. As your report points out, homeowners in Houston have seen prices go up, but those who don't, who are renters or trying to get in the homeowner market, I think we're going to see a widening inequality in the housing market as a result of this, sadly.
And Chris, when we talked earlier this week, you also talked about some interesting trends that you're seeing or hearing back from developers of both single family and multifamily. Can you touch a little bit on those?
Yeah, so my center has a relationship with market rate housing developers, and we had a meeting a week or so ago, and it was a quarterly check-in with them, and they were all incredibly surprised at the fact that they're seeing their demand for their housing rebound really quickly, and in fact are feeling like they're actually, from here on out, they expect the housing market for them to be on solid footing for the rest of the year. And it reflects what I was just describing, which is that for those who do have resources now, the importance of home has been highlighted. And so in particular, I think single family developers are seeing very strong demand for housing as people think about having more space, more privacy, more access to the outdoors. And this is all happening at a time too, where we have the millennial generation has been moving from their 20s into their 30s. So the Joint Center has been saying for a while now, and I think the Urban Institute as well, that as we see people move from their 20s to their 30s, we expect them to make that transition from renting towards home ownership. And up to now, I think part of the question has been how much of that will be concentrated in cities where millennials had shown a preference for living, and how much of that might be following the typical path out to suburbs. And I think what this is going to do is it's going to make that well-worn path to the suburbs much more likely, and creating, again, geographic differences too in how this plays out between core markets, denser markets, more reliant on public transit versus outlying areas where there's more space and air and I think people feel like they can be safer out there. So it's not going to be a single story. I mean, I think take a city like New York City. I think that there's really big questions about what's going to happen to the housing market in New York, as that was both the epicenter for the first COVID outbreak and a place where there's no avoiding density and all that comes with it.
Great, thanks, Chris. We've already touched on this a little bit, but I am curious how all three of you, and maybe Allison, we can start with you, thinking about the discussion we've had already about the historical inequities and some of the challenges we're facing. I'm wondering institutionally how each of you all have been thinking about the impacts of COVID, the current context around push for racial equity in broader society, and some of the housing information that we're talking about. What are you all thinking about, and how are you thinking about those interlacing challenges, and what are you thinking about doing institutionally?
For Habitat, I believe what we need to do is we've been talking across all of our affiliates the practices that we have and whether or not we have taken a lens of silence versus a lens of action. There's some practices in Habitat such as sweat equity, which is a lovely way of investing into your home through education and construction. But that does put a burden on families, especially if they are working 2 jobs and having children, that may put an unfair disadvantage to our families, our low-income families, especially our families that are generationally trying to build their wealth with grandparents and parents and children trying to live close to one another. The other concept we're trying to think about is, especially in Houston, Kyle, is this comprehensive housing plan where we could have, as a city, the ability to have a forethought plan on how housing would look in our city, so that as the flood zones and the areas that traditional African historical neighborhoods are in have gotten more of a floodway, that we can have a plan that we can make sure that those families are either elevated or able to celebrate the same historical areas that we have with an equitable lens versus taking the CDBG money that we have right now and not being able to apply it into areas that we really know we want to keep as historical for Houston.
Thanks, Allison, and a good plug for the housing study that the Kinder Institute is actually the prime contractor on for Harris County at the moment, and working with the city of Houston to finalize a contract there as well. And that project is just kicking off, and all of those goals that you just laid out are a critical part of that. Thanks, Allison. Mary, what are you all at the Urban Institute? How have you been grappling with the last month and last several months and thinking about your work going forward?
Yeah, I mean, I think at Urban we have, we sort of have a strong history of looking at housing with a racial equity lens. We've looked at the impacts of segregation, the costs of segregation, and also have done a lot of discrimination studies. I think we have, looked at our work as sort of centering our analysis and looking at equity, but we've done a great job of describing the problems, right? So we look at the disparities. I think we actually ground the disparities and try to explain them pretty well. But I think more and more we want to think about what are the solutions? What does an equitable housing strategy look like? How can you develop an anti-racist housing policy? What do those policies look like? And how can you make sure that these disparities that we see so clearly in the data, how do we really leverage policy and program solutions to make sure that they're addressing those disparities? I think that's the work we're really passionate about. And I think as we move forward with COVID, one of the pieces that we've been really looking at is thinking about what is the level of assistance that needs to go to renters, and not only thinking about sort of newly unemployed residents, but also those have been historically challenged in the rental and homeownership market. So really centering not only race and sort of our descriptions of the challenges, but also thinking about solutions. And then really thinking about data not as the end game, really thinking about how to use data and research to impact policy and make changes in the real world.
What Mary just said. I think as a research institution, we have long had put a focus on the racial disparities and outcomes in the housing market. And so I think that's not new for us, but I think we're rethinking our communication strategy. Obviously, we failed at some level to the extent that, we, along with everyone else, haven't led to any systemic or significant levels of changes in the outcomes that we're seeing. So I think we're recommitting ourselves to making sure that issues around racial disparities and racial justice in the housing market are central to what our reports are known for. I think, as I talked about earlier, I think our mission is to raise awareness of housing issues and to inform policy advocacy and industry. And I think reminding people about the ways in which housing is part of a structural racism, and it's central, I would argue, to structural racism is important. It's going to put a premium, I think, on not just access to affordable housing, but access to a broader range of communities, which has been challenging for us as a country. It means that both in assisted housing and also in market rate housing, and what kind of opportunities are there to build a range of housing types at ranging price points in different communities. And I'll just say too, kind of aside from our role as an organization that is a research organization, we need to rethink our role as an organization that hires, that trains, that gives people opportunities to speak. And so I think we're trying to look inward at our role in those areas as well, and think, how can we do better as a center, as an organization, to provide opportunities and a platform for people of color as well.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, definitely a time for both continued inward looking and externally thinking about where our work can go and should go and how it looks going forward. All of you have mentioned this already in a couple of the questions, and I'm going to have this sort of be our my last wrap up, and I'll move to some of the public Q&A, both about some of the report that I may loop you guys into because it's out of the Houston context. If there's other information you want to share, feel free to jump in. But my last question for you all, you've all mentioned some of these policy changes and ideas about how to start moving from the gaps we know and the challenges we know exist and we see daily. Whether it's directly COVID related and going back to ideas for new rental assistance or new expansion of those programs or closing some of these gaps amongst racial groups in the housing system, what are some of the things you all are tracking, or what are some of the major policy ideas you've seen to move beyond sort of here's what the challenge is and here's where we're seeing, whether it's a national example or a local example? Let's work back through that. Chris, why don't you start, and we'll go back from Mary and then to Allison.
Yeah, I mean, so I think I've touched upon some of them. I think in terms of if we think about what we need to have a housing system that's fairer, we need to have broader access to housing that's affordable. And what that means is, by necessity, we're going to have more subsidies for the poorest households who are just out of reach from the private sector. It means we have to think about ways of expanding the ability of the private sector to reach people more in the middle of the income distribution. And that means looking at regulatory barriers and other impediments to building. I've seen in the chat, people ask questions about smaller houses and tiny houses, and all those things need to be part of the quiver of arrows we use in addressing this. And so it starts with thinking about how do we expand use of subsidies, make more efficient use of subsidies? How do we enable the private sector to produce housing more affordably? And then I think we've touched upon, personally, I'm a big advocate for homeownership as a means of wealth creation and locking in housing costs so that you're protected against rent inflation. And what kind of supports do we need in place for people to be able to access homeownership? Your report does a great job of documenting the ways in which prices are accelerating and going beyond people's ability to buy. I think it speaks to the need for down payment assistance and encouragement of savings. It speaks to the need for housing counseling and education to prepare people to navigate the system, to apply for a mortgage. It speaks to the need for affordable, safe mortgage products. It speaks to the need for some creative approaches to making homeownership affordable where it is well out of reach. And those include things like shared equity models and community land trusts and the like. So there's a really broad range of things. And we as a center, Mary talked about highlighting solutions. Our role is to try to provide information and inform policy, but I do think we can also play a role in surfacing categories of ideas and levers that are important to pull to help inform that policy discussion without having to go so far into advocating specifically what we should do. But there's a lot we can do.
Thanks, Chris. Mary, what are your thoughts on that big one? And I'll just flag that one of the participants has asked specifically, I think, to some of the pieces you mentioned you were working on, what are some really definitive examples and what they can do as a non-academic as well, if you want to reflect on that.
Yep. I would just say you have, starting with this report, you have great data about the housing needs for Houston and Harris County. And I think that the next step I would really think about is setting some targets, some production targets, because obviously your supply isn't keeping up with demand, and really thinking about production targets by income band, because I think that you'll probably, if you look at your pipeline, you could probably see that there are some units coming online, but they're probably at the sort of middle to higher end, as some of your data shows. And so really looking at where are the gaps, what are the gaps for the lowest income, middle income, and then thinking also about a preservation strategy. I think we often think about affordability in terms of production, which is obviously really important to, we know from the data that supply isn't keeping up, but we also know that a lot of units are going offline and are being lost over time, some of the more naturally occurring affordable housing, and that's really important to hold on to really closely. You don't want that, that affordable housing that you have right now to disappear. So just really understanding what that catalog looks like. Is it subsidized housing that is expiring? Is it market rate housing that is going offline, or being renovated at a higher price point? So I would just think about really a comprehensive housing plan that sets targets and focuses both on production and preservation. I think every place is different. Local housing policy is really local. So thinking about Houston and really looking at those targets, and then thinking about what are your policy levers that you have, to increase subsidy, to really align all of your federal resources, to think about density and where you're locating your affordable housing. I think those are all really important.
Thanks, Mary. And any ideas for individuals who are involved in these conversations or thinking about their neighborhoods? Any thoughts on what they can be?
As an individual, I would say, NIMBY is a huge problem across the country. And so supporting affordable housing, showing up at those meetings, and making sure that you're supporting affordable housing development in your neighborhood is a great place to start.
A NIMBY being not in my backyard, so sort of the tendency to push against a project proposal or a plan in your community. Thanks, Mary. Allison, what you've already touched on building from what Mary just touched on the planning side and thinking about what we're doing locally. What other policies or thoughts do you have about what could be happening?
Well, I think Houston, as the fourth largest city, has the ability to make some statements in the housing market. But we were talking specific to COVID, and I know that the Housing Assistance Fund that was passed, I would implore all of us to keep an eye on that as COVID becomes more than an incident, but maybe an annual event, as pandemics and disasters are. Maybe we should talk to our representatives and senators and say that we need to be more proactive in handling our disasters as a nation. And that can be done using the example of some of the great legislation that got passed very quickly for the pandemic. The other idea that I advocate for is there's a program called the SHOP program, which is a HUD program, and it's been around for years. There's a sweat equity component on it, which if you're in a pandemic, the recipients, the homeowners that would be able to get those funds, they can't go out and complete that work. So Habitat as a group has advocated that that change in the legislature and the House, so that we could open up those funds which are already budgeted. And on a state level, there is a small amount of funds, which is a great legislation. It's called the bootstrap, and it's a self-funding way to help lowest of income, 50 below, for them to be able to become homeowners. It funds itself because it's able then to be paid back. And it's a very small one for our state, but Habitat keeps continuing to advocate for it. Urban areas never get it because there's so many little money and the need is great all over the state. But there are legislation, there are acts involved, there's budget items already in our system that we need to look at with an equity lens to make sure that we can say that we're actually getting it to the people that need it the most. And then for Houston as a whole, one thing that Chris and Mary have both talked about is this rising cost of housing. It puts a worry for our homeowners and for homeowners that don't even, renters that can't dream of a home. And it's that increase in cost of materials and the increase of permitting now that we've got a lot of flooding. There's a lot of incidental costs that have come up due to Atlas 14 and adding into our new floodplains, which is really going to create barriers for individuals at the lower scale. So when they want an affordable, safe home, the subsidies are going to have to be greater, or we're going to have to reevaluate what what areas we build in, and how we get our comprehensive housing plan to represent, the greater Houston area.
Thanks, Allison. And I think I just wanted to build briefly off of all three of you to talk a little bit about how the Kinder Institute is thinking about this work for the state of housing going forward. So we consciously chose not to do policy recommendations in this inaugural report and want to talk with stakeholders about what that looks like in the future. And we did that because the Institute generally often does sort of what we call data baselines and framing documents, where what we want to establish first is a sort of central location where we can all understand the scope of the problem, and then use that to continue to come back to that and continue to update that annually so we can talk about how it informs policy. So we want to use this initial report to kind of seed that conversation with all of you who are on today and many more, to think about, okay, now that we see these gaps and now that we know they're, with the goal of having the knowledge updated every year and understanding how the trends are changing every year, how does that then feed into policy? So I know there are a number of questions about sort of where this plugs into those questions of decisions at the local, state, and federal level, and I just wanted to clarify that. Okay, so I'm now looking at a range of questions that we have over here in the Q&A, and one that I don't have a definitive answer at the county level is about how housing programs and housing discrimination for folks who have been through the criminal justice system fit in here. And I was wondering, Chris and Mary, if either of you have touched on that or are aware of any particular programs or policies that are oriented around helping people re-enter after being in the criminal justice system.
I can start, unless you want to, Chris.
I know your colleagues have done a lot of work on this, so maybe you personally.
Yeah, I mean, I mean, it's certainly for people who are re-entering, leaving prison. There are a lot of challenges, and some of them have to do with just thinking about discharge planning and whether or not housing is available for people. So making sure there's transitional housing, or that people are connected with their support networks, which, is really hard when you are in prison for long periods of time. Oops, sorry. My phone rang. And so and that also people who have criminal records face discrimination in the housing market, right? So when you are filling out an application and you are checking that box around criminal background, many landlords will not rent to you because of that criminal background or that history. And so I think that thinking about discharge planning, working with corrections, but also making sure that there is housing available and that it's connected with those systems is really important.
Thanks, Mary. Chris, did you have more to add that?
No, I think one thing I'd point out too is that I think assisted housing, public housing, often have regulations related to occupancy by convicted felons and all that too. I think we need to look within the assisted housing world too to make sure that policies and procedures aren't discriminating against folks coming out of prison. So some researchers in the sociology department at Harvard have found that they were criminologists, and they were looking at successful reentry, and what they were surprised by was the access to stable housing was a critical role in making sure people had a successful reentry. And so I don't think we can underestimate the importance of housing as part of that strategy, and it has to be thought out from the beginning.
Mm-hmm. And really the importance, I think one thing I'm taking away from all of y'all's comments is continuing to look at the policies and programs we have in place, right? And not just assuming that they continue to work and don't need to be updated. And it's, something as simple as a checkbox on a form that we don't think of as needing to potentially shift or think about a new way of approaching that challenge. And it's kind of a constant process of reinventing and innovating to make sure we're housing folks. Go ahead. Yeah.
I was just going to say that I think Chris is making a really important point, and housing authorities have a lot of discretion in how they make decisions about people with criminal histories. And I think housing authorities often overlook that HUD has really left it up to them. And so this is something that you could decide locally. I don't know if your housing authorities have these policies, but you could certainly kind of audit that to see if something that could be changed with local discretion.
Great, thanks for highlighting that, Mary. We have a question about the impact that the slowdown in the oil industry may have, which I think on home prices here, and I can touch a little bit on how we're tracking that, but then Chris, I'm also curious how you all, looking with your State of the Nation's housing study, have encountered sort of regional trends and how you grapple with those and think about the changes that will happen. So I think generally what we'll be looking for, certainly in the years to come, is how the decline in the industry impacts housing. And we think it'll happen in multiple places, right? It's again going to be folks losing income, whether it's through furloughs or through the loss of jobs, obviously. And we also would anticipate that, I'm anticipating a similar slowdown as we saw, but potentially worse as we saw in 2015 and 2016 when the oil economy slowed down. So the question of how long it will go and how impactful it will be, I think, is yet to be seen. And, you know, especially since there seemed to be sort of a month and a half of extreme terror about what is happening with the energy sector, and some of that narrative has changed, but it's also tied into how Houston responds to that and how Houston continues to build forward as an energy leader, right? So I think it'll be certainly interesting to watch and see how it comes into those trends. Chris, how do you guys deal with sort of regional impacts when you're looking at the national scale?
Yeah, it's always a challenge to tell a national housing story because, you know, housing is fundamentally local. That said, I would say that we've been in a period where sort of macro forces have been pretty evident across the country. And so two of those were the oversupply of housing during the boom, the undersupply of housing since, which has really been evident across the country. The other is what happens with interest rates. And interest rates obviously are mostly a national, they vary a little bit market to market, but not much. And so when you look at the situation in Texas, it's a little different than it might be in, say, the Northeast, but still it's a tight market and low interest rates. And so while the oil industries, you know, being on a downward trend will mean that the economy's not going as much as it was, I would expect to still see that pressure on house prices in Houston because supply is tight and interest rates are low. So, you know, it depends on the time you're in, how much variation there is across the country. The 1980s were a period where every part of the country seemed to be following its own cycle. Since then, we've seen much more consistent cycles. It's really been more the kind of amplitude of that cycle than it has been the direction. So it's made our life a little easier, but I think one of the things we're seeing with this COVID pandemic is that there are some significant differences across regions. And so places like Las Vegas or Orlando, which is so reliant on tourism and air travel and big crowds of people, may be harder to recover depending upon what happens with the pandemic than places in the industrial Midwest where there's less of that reliance on those kind of industries that have been most impacted. So we'll, you know, at this point, we're keeping our eye on it, but I think we may see some greater regional variation depending on how the pandemic plays out.
My new line is that there are too many unknown unknowns, and I think the answer of we're keeping our eye on it, I know, is unsatisfying, and I've given it at least 3 times already today. But it is, I mean, it's just such a this is such a singular moment across so many elements of our lives and our society that it is really a matter of seeing where we head. Allison, I'll maybe start with you on this one. A couple people have asked questions about how, and you all have touched on the importance of preservation and the importance of maintaining naturally occurring affordable housing. Obviously, Allison Habitat is focused on bringing folks into new homes and having them help bring those online. But I'm also curious if, obviously, folks then live in those for a number of years, and I'm wondering how you all as an organization and how you think about sort of helping people keep up with maintenance and keep up with preserving the stock that you've built and how you've seen that play out.
Well, I think that since Harvey, any houser that is in the Houston area that built homes, a nonprofit, we're repairing homes, because housing preservation for communities is the linchpin for those. So it's to repair and maintain housing stock that's already on the ground with a maintenance program and with outreach to make sure that we have enough city and county funds to help for maintenance for homeowners that may be on a fixed income, maybe their income is below 50% AMI. And then to have nonprofits, and I will say that the long-term recovery group, Harris County Long-Term Recovery, we have a whole initiative on how to keep repairs going post Harvey, so that even if you weren't affected by it, we're trying to keep your stock, because those are the most important community builders, is the families that have been there for 30, 40 years. Now, if there's a lot next to them and we would like for them to have a new homeowner, Habitat's right there, and so are a lot of the other affordable housing people. But the maintenance component of a house is, it's very hard once you have an income where the repairs start to take on a cost that is a small car. So there needs to be an advocacy piece for repair, but at the same time, having to train and teach and help our younger generation, or our people that like to swing a hammer, for them to be able to go out and help others on the repair. All of our communities, especially in the center of Houston and our historic neighborhoods, those are awesome homes. And to repair a home has a cost difference. You can repair, the price of a new home, you can repair 3 current homes. So whoever talked about the current housing stock, that's an important part for any city to keep their character and to keep neighborhoods intact.
And Chris and Mary, one thing that we highlight in the full report is that rental stock tends to be older and likely is facing some of those maintenance challenges. And we also know from other research that in times of economic slowdown or downturns, that often landlords can allow maintenance to defer even longer. What are some, have you encountered any ways to sort of to think about fixing that or addressing that? I know there are local measures obviously around inspections and other types of making sure homes are safe and habitable, but are there any national conversations, or have you looked at that challenge at a broader level outside of Houston and Harris County?
Mary, do you want to go first?
Sure. I mean, I think you mentioned, I mean, obviously there's sort of the carrot and the stick, right? So enforcement of housing quality locally is really important, but I also think working with landlords who, you know, a lot of the sort of lower units available to lower income or modest income people, it's you're talking about smaller landlords often. So really thinking about rehab and preservation strategies that offer either short-term loans or even grants to landlords, and trying to use that as a way to lock in affordability contracts. So that is one strategy, certainly. And so I think really, and I think also looking at really looking at your catalog of already subsidized housing. So that, you know, focusing on sort of the naturally occurring housing, affordable housing in the market is really important, and working with those landlords, but also making sure that your currently subsidized housing is staying online. And, you know, I think from what I've seen across the country, just having data about what that catalog looks like is often an overwhelming step. And so I think that's where you start. I'll pass to Chris.
Yeah, I don't know that I have much to add to that, Kyle. I mean, I would just, I guess, put out a plug for one of my pet policy proposals, which is, I think one of the challenges with dealing with small landlords is that they're very dispersed. The idea of engaging with a program, having to document rents, there is going to be a quid pro quo. If we're going to give you some support, we want to see rents kept low, is actually to use a broader brush of tax policy and to think about creating greater incentives through the tax structure for investment in rehab. And so that would mean things like making the depreciation schedules shorter and the like. Because every landlord fills out tax return every year, and they can see that hit the bottom line. And what we ought to be doing is thinking about broadly maintaining the housing stock we have to be in good condition, and thinking about those tools. So that may be more of a federal response than a state response, but it's one that I think would have pretty broad impact.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, and again, a really important reminder that it's not just policies that are about building new homes, or that it's not just about how you get buildings on the ground. It's also all of these other elements that structure the system and allow us to potentially reform it.
Right. And I guess the flip side of this is, you know, your report documents, which is very consistent with our reports, the loss of low-cost units. And we should just be clear when we're talking about loss, That doesn't mean they disappear, but
Mhm.
it means is that they're moving up the rent spectrum, right? And so what we're saying is the whole rent distribution shift, right? And I don't know about Houston, maybe you can speak to this, Kyle, but in high cost markets, fill in your favorite blank for the West Coast, the East Coast, developers are seeing opportunities with existing so-called naturally occurring affordable housing saying, but if I came in and I put in some new appliances and changed the lobby furniture and did a little bit of cosmetics, I can push the rent up because the new supply is not there. And so there's really nothing naturally occurring about this affordable housing. It's natural in certain market circumstances, and it's naturally disappearing affordable housing in other circumstances. And so as much as we're talking about now the lack of maintenance, I think the flip side of that is the over investment to upscale housing. And so trying to make sure there's ways to basic housing, 70s, 80s era garden apartments into hands of people who want to maintain it as affordable, not necessarily deeply affordable, but middle market affordable for a longer period of time is important too.
Yeah, that's absolutely happening in Houston. I can't compare the scale necessarily, but many of the apartments in neighborhoods throughout the city are that 1970s and 80s garden apartment, and many of them are being redone, either being redone and upscaled, or many of them are being taken down and being replaced with other units, which I think is a big part of, we don't delve into that information that I shared in the report in terms of the cost incredibly deeply, but we are able to do that in the future. And it is a lot of those different types of shifts of where either new homes are being put on top of formerly demolished ones, or places are being upscaled. And I would also say, Mary, you mentioned the expiration of affordability, and I believe I have these numbers off the top of my head. The risk, so Houston already has a relatively low subsidized number of housing units. It's about 75,000. And from previous research, I know that nearly half of those are within 5 to 10 years of potentially losing their affordability requirements. And so just understanding that those limitations that get put in place onto a particular project with a for-profit or nonprofit developer can expire. And so that number of 75, while we add more each year with low-income housing tax credits and other pieces, it's not an insignificant number of that very deeply subsidized and affordable housing that could be gone if we're not paying attention to it and making sure you're reevaluating that.
Yeah, I'm sure if you mapped those, that would affect certain neighborhoods disproportionately. And some of those neighborhoods might be neighborhoods that are at risk of gentrifying. So also thinking about a geographic strategy for those expiring units can be critical to thinking about how it fits into your whole housing plan.
Absolutely. Thanks. And maybe as our last question, another big one, but another really important one that I think speaks back to sort of the interconnection of all of this. I'm wondering if all three of you can speak to, we've touched a number of times on the importance of income, the importance of the elements outside of the house, right? All of the pieces that a household is confronting and the challenges they're confronting, with low incomes being a big part of that. And the issue of growing income inequality and stagnant wages feeding directly into this, right? Folks not being able to find affordable homes, not being able to stay in their homes. What are some of the ways we can be thinking about addressing that? Are there particular policies? Is it just broadening the housing conversation to make sure we're talking about income? How do we bring those interconnected pieces in? And Mary, I can start with you and then go backwards to Chris and Allison.
Sure. I mean, I do think that, and I sort of mentioned this earlier, I think really understanding, if you're thinking about this from a housing perspective, thinking about kind of the gap in units by income bands, because, you know, as Chris pointed out, the whole market is interacting, and as more and more units come online at the upper end, thinking about, are they filtering down, and also thinking about where the affordable housing is disappearing. So really setting those sort of production targets and preservation targets by income is really important. Think about broader income strategies, you know, looking at your local wages and whether or not how they meet the sort of living wage standards, and thinking about efforts and campaigns to raise those incomes and hourly wages is, I think, a critical piece. But often, you know, as incomes rise, the housing market catches up. So I think that it's still important to think about those strategies, but also you've just got to think about your sort of income targets or your production targets by income.
Chris, thoughts on that?
Yeah, you know, one of our charts in our report goes back 50, 60 years and looks at what's happened with incomes and what's happened with housing prices. And they've been doing this for a long period of time. So, and I say that as a houser, I'm worried about the top line, but the fundamental problem may be that bottom line of what's happening with incomes. And so as a houser, it becomes difficult to say, what do you have to say about what do we do about incomes? And Mary touched upon some in terms of wage policies, and it gets back to education policy, workforce development policy. One thing I would highlight, I guess, is in the specific realm of assisted housing. There's an opportunity, and Mary and her colleagues have done a lot of work about this, to think about housing as a platform for opportunity. And so you have households who have been historically disadvantaged in a number of domains, and you have them in a community. And so you have an opportunity to use that agglomeration of people in a community to reach out with workforce development, education, childcare supports, mental health supports, in order to get people prepared to advance in the labor market. And so there are opportunities, I think, for us to use housing as a platform for economic advancement as well that we should give more attention to. But the other thing, I guess, as a houser I'd point to is that this long run trend has been a long run trend for a whole host of reasons. And the expectation that this is going to stop is probably not right. So the question then is, well, what do we do about that? And I would say is what we really have to focus on is creating more permanently affordable housing. So we're not just addressing this year's problem, but the fact that 20 years from now, this problem will be here as well. So we need longer term supports for rental housing that's permanently affordable. We need longer term permanent supports for homeownership affordability along the lines I mentioned earlier, shared equity, community land trusts and the like, where someone can get in, build up some equity, and then if they want to, can move on to fee simple housing and make room for someone else, or stay in that community for a long time, but it's permanently affordable. And I think that's really got to be part of our, built into our policies, is always thinking that this gap is only going to get bigger. We got to make sure we're adding to it and not losing what we're adding.
Thanks, Chris. And Allison, how do you all at Habitat work with that? I mean, I know that's a big part of your effort is to get people into home ownership. Well, how do you think about connecting that to those broader challenges they may be facing around income and gaps?
As Chris and Mary both allude to, the salary component has the average hourly wage, especially in the Houston area, it's flat. And so we try to bring the housing prices closer to what they can have through on affordability for their 30% through subsidized components, whether it's sponsorships or land. But the issue for me when you talk about that is that you move farther out of the urban core so that the land is cheaper, which then gives the homeowner and the family a different problem, which is transportation. So I think it all connects in, and we have to realize that the base, I think we're all very passionate about housing, but the housing could be the base so that we could build a culture and a city where we are able then to use all of our resources with transportation, with healthcare, childcare, and educational resources, and either bring it in so that we don't have the inner loop and the outer loop, but we have a comprehensive plan that will help support the wage earner, whether it's a single family, a single wage earner in the family, or 2 or 3 that are in the family that have to make the wage so that they can afford the housing that they live in. We have to look at all things. And I'm very passionate about what Chris said. We keep working on a knee-jerk reaction. I think we've seen that every time we have a disaster, we get money, and then, you know, we just don't have a plan that goes far enough along so that we can help families for generations and help Houstonians grow as a city. So I'm glad we brought this question up because it's kind of the crux of what's going on.
Thanks, Allison. And we're right at noon, so I just want to say thank you to Allison and Mary and Chris again for joining us today, and thanks for everybody for the great questions. Again, please stay tuned, read the report, let us know what you think about it, what else you think we need to add in subsequent years. Stay tuned for additional communication about giving us more of that feedback directly and other ways to tie into that. And the Kinder Institute is very much looking forward to working with everybody to think through these challenges and continuing to bring shared data to our region. So thanks everybody for attending today, and we'll be in touch. Take care.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Mary.